The Korean War, often labeled the Forgotten War, was anything but minor for the millions who lived through it. Fought between June 25, 1950 and July 27, 1953, it was the first large-scale armed clash of the Cold War era. What began as a regional struggle between North and South Korea quickly drew in global superpowers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, transforming the conflict into a high-stakes test of ideologies. The war had all the ingredients of global drama: surprise invasions, heroic counterattacks, controversial strategies, nuclear threats, and long, grinding stalemates. Although it ended without a clear victor, the Korean War profoundly shaped international politics and left behind a divided peninsula whose tensions still reverberate today. The division of Korea after World War II. Korea had endured 35 years under Japanese colonial rule, suffering cultural suppression and economic exploitation. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Korean people expected independence at last. Instead, they became pawns in the emerging Cold War rivalry. The Allies divided the country along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union occupying the North and the United States overseeing the South. This line was meant to be temporary, but it quickly hardened into a political border. In 1948, two separate governments emerged: Kim Il-sung's communist regime in the north, backed by Moscow, and Syngman Rhee's nationalist government in the south, supported by Washington. The two leaders had starkly different visions for Korea's future. Both claimed to be the legitimate ruler of the entire peninsula. Even after US and Soviet troops withdrew in 1949, hostilities simmered. The stage was set for open conflict. The outbreak of war. On June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. With Soviet equipment and planning, 75,000 North Korean soldiers poured into South Korea. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Within 3 days, the capital city of Seoul was in North Korean hands. The South Korean military, poorly equipped and underprepared, collapsed under the pressure. By summer, the North controlled nearly the entire peninsula, leaving only a small defensive pocket around the port city of Busan. For the United States, this was alarming. President Harry Truman believed in the domino theory. If South Korea fell to communism, other nations in Asia could topple one after another. To Truman, the Korean War was not just about Korea, it was about stopping the spread of communism worldwide. The United Nations steps in. South Korea appealed to the United Nations for help. Under normal circumstances, the Soviet Union would have vetoed any UN resolution against its ally. But in a twist of fortune, the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council because the UN had refused to seat Communist China in place of Taiwan. This absence allowed the United States to push through resolutions condemning the invasion and authorizing military assistance. 16 nations pledged support, though the vast majority of troops came from the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, the celebrated World War II commander, was chosen to lead the multinational force. The involvement of the UN gave the mission a sense of global legitimacy. It wasn't just the US defending South Korea, it was the international community standing against aggression. The Busan Perimeter and the Incheon Landing. By late summer 1950, UN and South Korean forces were crammed into a defensive circle around Busan in the southeast. Supplies and reinforcements flowed in through the port, allowing them to hold out against repeated North Korean attacks. This desperate stand became known as the Busan Perimeter. While the world worried the war might end with South Korea's collapse, MacArthur devised a daring plan. On September 15, 1950, U.S. Marines launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city far behind enemy lines. The operation was risky. Tides, mudflats, and narrow channels made Incheon nearly impossible to invade. But the gamble worked. The surprise landing cut off North Korean supply lines, forcing a rapid retreat. Seoul was recaptured within weeks, and by the end of September, South Korea was back under UN control. What had seemed like a hopeless defense turned into a stunning reversal of fortune. marching into North Korea. Having regained the South, UN leaders faced a crucial decision: stop at the 38th parallel or press on to destroy North Korea's regime. MacArthur argued for full victory. President Truman, though wary of Chinese intervention, gave cautious approval. UN troops crossed into the north in October. Within days, they seized Pyongyang, and by late October, they stood at the banks of the Yalu River, the border with China. For a brief moment, it seemed the war might end with Korea united under Southern leadership. But China was watching closely. Mao Zedong, alarmed at the prospect of American troops on his doorstep, decided to act. By November, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers crossed into Korea, tipping the balance once again. China's intervention. China's entry was a turning point. Their sudden assault in the freezing winter of 1950 caught UN forces off guard. Vast waves of Chinese soldiers overwhelmed American, South Korean, and Allied troops. What had looked like victory turned into a devastating retreat. Seoul fell to Communist forces in January 1951, marking the second time the capital had changed hands. The fighting was brutal. Soldiers battled in icy mountains and endured bitter cold as supply lines faltered. The optimism of Incheon was replaced by a grim struggle for survival. MacArthur versus Truman. As the war dragged on, MacArthur pushed for escalation. He wanted to bomb Chinese bases, blockade their coast, and even considered using nuclear weapons to break the stalemate. To him, half measures meant certain defeat. President Truman, however, feared widening the conflict into a Third World War. He insisted on limiting the war to Korea. The disagreement boiled over when MacArthur publicly criticized U.S. policy. In April 1951, Truman dismissed him for insubordination. The decision was controversial. MacArthur was a hero to many Americans, but it underscored Truman's commitment to containment rather than reckless escalation. Stalemate at the 38th parallel. By mid-1951, UN forces counterattacked and retook Seoul. The front stabilized near the original dividing line, the 38th parallel. From that point on, the war became a grueling stalemate. Fighting shifted to hills, trenches, and fortified outposts, echoing the trench warfare of World War I. Artillery barrages, sniper duels, and night raids replaced sweeping offensives. In the skies, American pilots clashed with Soviet-trained aviators flying under Chinese markings. Meanwhile, peace talks opened in July 1951 at Panmunjom, but negotiations stalled over prisoner exchanges and territorial boundaries. For 2 more years, soldiers endured bloody battles while diplomats argued at the table. The road to armistice. In January 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became President of the United States. Determined to end the war, he hinted at the possibility of using nuclear weapons to pressure the enemy. At the same time, the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin weakened communist resolve. Finally, on July 27, 1953, both sides signed an armistice at Panmunjom. The agreement halted the fighting, but did not officially end the war. A demilitarized zone was established along the 38th parallel, stretching 2.5 miles wide across the peninsula. Heavily fortified, it remains one of the most dangerous borders in the world today. The war's human cost. The Korean War was catastrophic for civilians. Entire cities were destroyed, families were divided, and millions were displaced. Estimates suggest that over 2.5 million Koreans, both north and south, were killed or wounded. China lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, while the United States suffered more than 36,000 battle deaths. For ordinary Koreans, the greatest tragedy was the division of their homeland. Families were permanently separated by the new border, and decades later, many still wait for reunions that never come. Lasting impact. The Korean War, though often overshadowed by World War II and Vietnam, had a profound and lasting impact on modern history. It deepened the Cold War by entrenching hostility between East and West, and setting the stage for later proxy wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and beyond. China's successful intervention proved its strength as a formidable power, and established its influence in Asia. The conflict also cemented the permanent division of the Korean Peninsula, leaving North Korea isolated and authoritarian, while South Korea developed into a prosperous democracy. More broadly, the war revealed the immense dangers of the Cold War, as nuclear threats loomed just beyond the battlefield. And that brings us to the end of today's video on the Korean War, a conflict that shaped the Cold War and left behind a divided peninsula that remains tense even today. If you found this video interesting, make sure to hit that like and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.